Hello everybody, and welcome to the Radical Notions YouTube channel. I am Charlie Edun. I'm a doula and a researcher at Coventry University looking at maternity issues, and I am here today talking to Milli Hill, who is author of The Positive Birth Book and Give Birth Like a Feminist, and I've just had a mental blank about the name of your period book.
My Periods.
My Periods.
Which is for preteen girls, that one.
Which is for preteen girls, and currently sitting on a deadline for submission of your next book, I think.
Yeah, sitting on, it's a very uncomfortable seat. So.
Well, thank you for making time to talk to today. It's lovely. We are going to be talking about female bodies and motherhood and birth, in relation really to the Radical Notions spring summer issue this year, which is about motherhood, the motherhood issue. So I had quite an interesting conversation. I thought I'd lead in with this, if that's okay. I had quite an interesting conversation with a client of mine who is pregnant for the first time, and we were talking about what happens when you go into labour. Like, how do you know that your body is labouring? What does it feel like? What does it look like? What should you do? How quickly should you phone somebody? How do you know when you should phone somebody? And it was really interesting to me. It sort of reminded me of all the other conversations I've had with birth doula clients over the years, and also reminded me of what it was like when I was pregnant the first time. And I'm very conscious that women have very little idea about how their bodies function in reality. Like, what is the reality of this thing going to be like? Because we just don't see it anymore. We don't really have a vocabulary to talk about the realities of it anymore. And it's really kind of bound up in this mythology about what birth is and why you should be scared of it. And I was reminded by you this morning, before we came on this call, about how you had written about that in Give Birth Like a Feminist, and about how it is that we just don't really have access to like other women's experiences of our physiological processes in the same way.
Yeah, it kind of goes back quite a long, if you start to sort of go backwards in history, you find it goes back quite a long way, but really it goes, if you think about a very long time ago, when birth was just a woman's affair, and birth happened in a community, and the women of the community were held the wisdom about birth and passed on the wisdom. But then, slowly as you come through history and you find birth moving into the hands of men, basically, and moving into hospitals. Then what happens is what people of our generation are very familiar with, is this idea of mum is pregnant and she goes to hospital and she comes back with a baby. So as children, if you've got siblings, that might be your experience of their birth. Mum disappears and she comes back with a baby. So the sounds of birth, the smells of birth, the atmosphere of birth, and women in early labour even, and all of that is just not something that many of us witness anymore. And there's a lot of wisdom that gets passed on just through being around those experiences, I think, and then we're just not. And then what that's replaced with, of course, is what we see on the telly. It's worth talking about programs like This Is Going to Hurt or One Born Every Minute, because although they're a load of crap, they are the only experience of labouring women that's a lot of pregnant women will see before they have their baby.
And there's a really interesting parallel with menstruation studies as well. I can't remember her first name, but she's an Australian academic called Damery, who wrote a book about menstruation. She talks about like the Anglo-Australian culture of silence around bodily processes. On the one hand, like, we just don't talk about bodies, we don't talk about period blood, and we don't talk about how it looks and how it happens, and we don't talk about those first couple of weeks after you've had a baby, when you're bleeding and your vulva's recovering, and if you had any perineal trauma, your stitches are recovering, and your breasts are creating milk and changing, and like literally what your body looks like. So on the one hand, we've got like this this culture of silence where it's physically removed, but also we don't have the vocabulary for it. And then on the other hand, it becomes really corporatized and commercialized. So the only way that you can access it really is by paying for it. You know, you either pay to go to classes, or you pay to buy the books, or you pay to do an online course. And of course, all of that then compromises the information that you're provided with, because it's about reselling the courses and about getting you to buy into what you're doing and about, you know, promoting the brand that is selling this thing to you. So you've got like, there's like this double whammy that prevents women from kind of like accessing or really experiencing their own like physiological functioning beyond like the reflection, like the cultural reflection. It's like the female body is like a blank canvas, and the only way that you can experience it is through the reflections of these cultural ideas, rather than actually observing it and making your own decisions about how do you feel about it, how do you want to manage it.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, one thing that's interesting that's happened in recent times is social media. So women have started sharing more about those sorts of experiences on social media. So you'll go on Instagram and you'll see a woman wearing her, you know, maternity pad or whatever. But at the same time, those images have been censored by Facebook and now Instagram. And in fact, there was a thing this week, I think, where a body form advert was trying to get people to, you know, it was asking people about words like vulva. What is it? Do you know what a vulva is? And things like that. And that got taken down by Facebook. So there's, you know, there's this sort of anxiety around still talking about women's bodies that we all carry. You know, when you were talking as well about menstruation, I was thinking about the sort of the non-rustling pad and tampon wrappers. You know, they actually advertise them as that. I'm not sure they're still doing that. I think they might have gone quiet on that. But, you know, that there's still this idea that, you know, if you talk to other women, like, where do you keep your pads? You know, lots of women will say they don't have them out, you know, or they don't let their kids see. They double flush if they've got their period. They make sure their kids don't see blood in the toilet. And it's really, really interesting to just start to unpick all that and just think, why, you know, why do you not want the person in the next cubicle to know that you are opening a tampon?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's like the scented panty liners as well. You know, like all of these things are they're really covert, subtle ways of telling women that your body is not okay. Your body is flawed in some way, or it's disgusting, or it needs to be managed and controlled. You know, don't let people know, don't tell. I mean, I remember that thing being at school, you know, like with the tampon shoved up the school shirt, you know, as you walk out so that no one would see. And I, you know, like I was well past having my 3 kids before I was beyond that, you know, and I didn't have any fucks to give anymore. And I was just like, well, it's just a function, isn't it? And it's important that my kids know about it, because it's how bodies work, right? You know, it's important that you understand it. But like that whole kind of covert cultural thing about women's bodies not meeting the standard, not meeting the norm, you know, like normal bodies are male bodies that don't bleed. Normal bodies will conform to like these social ideas of what's acceptable for womanhood, which is to be neat and tidy and not have these porous boundaries, you know, not to be cyclical, to be consistent and standardized all the time. And that, you know, like those messages are really, I think they're quite powerful messages, and you see them everywhere really.
Yeah, and it's almost getting worse actually, I think, because if you look at the sort of like the markers for femininity at the moment and compare them to say the 1990s, they're far more sort of hyper feminized. You know, young women now, a lot of young women now are, you know, all the sort of contouring that goes on with the makeup and the fake eyelashes. And I hate to bring it up, but like, you know, surgery on their vulva to make their vulva look more, it's called a Barbie vulva or something. So it literally like a hairless, you can have actual surgery so that it's neater in inverted commas. All of these things are choices that women are making at the moment. You know, and then you look at people like Dylan Mulvaney, who is, you know, and other, you know, trans women who are utilizing that kind of hyper femininity in order to express that they are actually women. And that's
and what it's doing,
real women are sort of being given the message, I think, to slowly become just to hide more and more of what makes us real.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of doing two things, isn't it? You know, like on the one hand, what it's doing is it is separating the human being from the body, which is, you know, philosophically, that Cartesian dualism, you know, that actually we exist in the head. The head is elevated above the body because the head is where all of the objective, measured, calm, rational, thoughtful consideration happens, whereas the body is dirty and it's animalistic and it's subject to these urges and it's unclean and it needs to be managed. So it is such an old story that, you know, like it goes so far back in time. So that separation of the functioning of the human body as if the function is problematic in some way, really, that really is that androcentric idea that men's bodies are neat and tidy and perfect and that's okay, and women's bodies are dirty and horrid and unpleasant.
And female biological functions like menstruation and childbirth are great disruptors to that. They come in, and this brings you back really to the woman you were talking about of what's it going to be like?
Yeah.
Because what women are really asking when they're saying that is, what am I going to be like? Am I going to lose control?
Yeah.
Am I going to be real?
Yeah.
Am I going to be that real woman that my culture is consistently bombarding me, telling me isn't what femininity is, isn't the right way to behave? Like one midwife described a woman in labor as unseemly. I wrote that in Give Birth Like a Feminist. You know, it's this idea of being unladylike, unseemly. And now, you know, with the cultural messages we've got at the moment, sort of almost too real.
Yeah.
It's very disruptive.
It is very disruptive, and it also, you know, that sort of connects backwards again to the commercialization of it. You know, women haven't tested this because they've controlled their bodies. So who was it yesterday? Actually, it was Jane. I was watching Jane Clare Jones and Victoria Smith talking yesterday, and they were talking about how motherhood is radical and how motherhood radicalizes women. And my perspective on that, having watched it many times, is that the reason that women are radicalized by motherhood is they come into pregnancy holding these strong cultural myths about how birth is horrific, their bodies will fail, they won't function, women won't be able to cope, it's messy, it's dirty, it's unseemly, it's not ladylike, it needs to be controlled, it's dangerous, it's risky, all that kind of stuff. And then they come through the other side and they're like these two things do not connect. Like for a lot of women, birth is very difficult and very troublesome, and it can be very traumatic. But it's not difficult, troublesome, and traumatic because it's inherently difficult, troublesome, and traumatic. It's often because of the environment that it's done in. So when women disrupt that and they take control of their births, or they take control of their attitudes towards birth and their reflections on it, actually you come out the other side and it's like the veil is dropped, and suddenly you can see that actually women's bodies are not flawed, they're not failing, they are powerful. You know, women's bodies in birth are you know, they're more akin, again, who was it, you'll remember, was it Sarah Shabbat Cohen? She says that you know, women's bodies in birth are more akin to, you know, functioning with bodies in sport and dancing and all that kind of stuff, rather than this, you know, like this idea that we have birth as horrific, monstered. It's like, you know, women's bodies at birth are kind of monstered in some way. So it's really interesting to me that, you know, that is like the eye of the needle that many women pass through, and it really changes their understanding of how their bodies work and their control of them.
I mean, they witness firsthand, literally from the inside out, they witness that power. And I think, you know, when I've written about censorship, you know, one of the funny stories about censorship that will always stay with me is if you Google Milli Hill, Kim Kardashian, you'll find it. I mean, you know, my degrees of separation from Kim Kardashian are just that tiny.
So are mine. That's amazing.
Especially if you put the word bottom into Google as well, in the same thing. But yeah, what happened was, I can't remember what year it was about 8 years ago or something. It was when Kim Kardashian's bottom was breaking the internet. And if people don't remember that, she did a magazine cover where she, you know, was like highly oiled and stylized and completely unreal, with this big bottom and this champagne cork that was, I think she had the glass on her bum or didn't she, something, and it was shooting I don't know. Anyway, the thing was the
sexualized image, by the way,
yes,
of, you know, champagne shooting over her head towards her bottom, like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of feminist theory of the body to be had out of that single image, I think.
You get the idea, but by coincidence, by complete coincidence, on the same day that bottom, and the expression they used was it was going to break the internet, which, you know, kind of did in a way. But on the very same day, I had shared on the Positive Birth Movement Facebook page this photo of a birthing bottom. So it was shot from behind in the birth pool, and there was a baby coming out, basically. You couldn't see the vulva, but you could just see the back of her bum.
Yeah.
And you could sort of see her bum hole a little bit, I think. And there might have even been a little bit of poo. But if you didn't really know what you were looking at, it was just a bum anyway. Yeah. Facebook censored it. And so I tweeted, you know, hey, Facebook, you know, how come some bums are okay and some bums aren't, you know? And, you know, I did quite a lot of writing around that time about that sort of phenomenon that, you know, it's that some birth images don't get censored.
Yeah.
Some breastfeeding images don't get censored, you know, and it's all about whether they show the woman in, you know, if she's sanitized and hairless and covered with drapes or whatever, then, you know, that kind of like, that image is okay and acceptable, even if it's quite graphic. Whereas a woman who's in her power, who's upright, who's maybe hairy or pooey or, you know, giving birth in this active, roaring kind of animalistic way, those are the images that they always took down.
Yeah, so it's kind of the male gaze, isn't it? You know, like the images of birth that are tolerable and acceptable are ones that are tolerable within the kind of framework or within the tolerable boundaries of the male gaze. You know, women behaving, even in birth, even in this most female physiological moment, we have to conform to what men's idea, the male idea of perfect femininity is, you know.
I think it is that, but I think there's more to it than that as well, because I think it's the female power part. It's that, you know, it's the fact that the female body actually, you know, isn't just this, I mean, it is the male gaze, but it's the way that women are kept from that knowledge that through their biology, through experiences, through physical experiences like giving birth, they are the life givers. You know, it's the subversive message. It's the girl God, you know, the God is a woman kind of message. The whole of patriarchy and the religion that accompanies it is built upon telling us repeatedly that God is a man and man is the creator.
Yeah. So it's like that male dominance message, isn't it? And you know, Jane talks about this a lot, Lucy Irigaray, you know, this idea that that men understand themselves as being separate as being separate sovereign beings, to being independent and not dependent on anyone or anything. And that is like the central narrative of male dominance, is that men are not reliant on anyone. When you challenge that with the reality of what happens in birth, which is women gestate, birth, and then nourish other humans, and not just any other humans, but you were gestated, you were birthed, you were nourished by a female body, you were dependent on that body. And not only you as an individual, but the society and the culture that you live in is dependent on that essential labor that women do. Then it is a very challenging notion for male. It doesn't fit within the narrative of male dominance. And then the idea of the murder of the mother, you know, the only way to overcome the reality of the power of motherhood, the power of womanhood within that, is to make it small and to say, actually, it doesn't matter and it doesn't exist and it doesn't work properly. And then you take it out of its natural environment, you place it into an unnatural environment, and guess what? It doesn't work as well as it used to. And then you control that narrative. So it's a complex, multi-layered, hardwired belief that runs top to bottom all the way through our culture, isn't it?
Yeah. And you know, coming back to the practicalities of it, why are we not doing, you know, I think you just sort of almost answered the question of why are we not doing something about the huge levels of traumatic and high intervention birth that are happening to women in our culture today. I mean, that's probably what drew you into birth in the first place. It's certainly what drew me into birth in the first place. Not the sort of like, people think I like babies or something. I'm not remotely interested in babies. I'm interested in women's experiences, and I could not believe, as a sort of 30-something, with all my friends having babies, I couldn't believe what was happening to women, and that I didn't really realize this.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe how accepted it was.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that women were being told, leave your dignity at the door, or all that matters is a healthy baby. Like, what, we've talked about that phrase a lot, but for people who are new to it, this idea that women are told all that matters is a healthy baby, repeatedly when they're pregnant and after they've had their baby, and if they've had a traumatic birth, they're given that phrase as sort of form of reassurance.
And it's a form of management as well. If you don't do it, you'll have a dead baby, and therefore you must do what we say. So
yes,
like the maneuver, right?
In pregnancy, it's a form of management. So stop still getting your hopes up about birth, because all that matters is a healthy baby. Then postnatally, it's a form of management, because it's saying, stop talking about your traumatic birth. Don't be the bad mother who's caring only about herself. You look at your baby. That's the thing that matters. So rafts and rafts of our generation, and the younger women coming up now beneath us, and the older women above us, are traumatized by these experiences and are told to shut up about them, basically. And I think, but those experiences perpetuate the myth of the female body being inadequate and useless. So in a way, patriarchy needs that to be sustained.
Yeah.
But women who have those experiences, just to finish it, women who have those experiences blame themselves, as you know, Charlie. It's just, I get so. It really upsets me, because it just seems to be getting worse. Women having these experiences, being put into situations where no self-respecting mammal could easily give birth to their young, whatever kind of animal they are.
Yeah.
And then being told afterwards, that, or being given that whole encircling cultural narrative that this is just what birth is like. Women's bodies, what can we do?
Would love to help, but your silly bodies. I think the pandemic was a really, really interesting example of that, because when you look at the history, I mean, just the last 30 years, the history of what's happened in maternity strategy and maternity development and maternity policy. You look at all the research. What women always say is that they want to be centred. They don't necessarily. That because of the complexity of these cultural narratives, that not all women are the same, and not all women will have the same perspective on what they want and need. But the thing that is really important to women always consistently is about relational care, like knowing who their care providers are, having a good relationship with them, being able to engage in a dialogue rather than being on the conveyor belt that we know so many women get on, and once you're on, it's really hard to get off. And it was really interesting to me that in light of all of that stuff that had happened over 30 years or so, and we had the better births in 2007, and all of these policy documents that come out of government and come out of research, what actually happened in the pandemic was a really clear iteration of who holds the power in maternity care services, how women's bodies are understood and managed, actually, and what the role of birth and motherhood is in society. Because forget those early stages of the pandemic where everybody was adjusting and dealing with working out where it might go. I was working with women the following summer who were denied home births, denied births at birth centres, and having to go to have their babies in hospitals where they had been previously traumatised by the care they'd received, while football fans were at Wembley and men were getting drunk in pubs watching football.
Yeah.
Still now, we haven't reset all of those services across the country. Still now, there are some services, for example, sonography, and, I know that some units are having sorry, I'm looking out of the window of my computer, my neighbours just walked past me. That's what I'm and I forgot. I'm so comfortable talking to you. I forgot that I'm actually talking to lots of other people as well. So I think it's really interesting what happens when the shit hits the fan, really. When the shit hits the fan, it's not.
I remember talking to you about it at the time, and actually I wrote about some of that in the sort of extra chapter I did for the book after the pandemic, after, you know what I mean? Yeah. But, this idea of the story was that everything's being pared back to its essentials.
Yeah.
And really what it was pared back to was what's essential for the system.
Yes.
What's essential for the woman. That was not on the radar.
Yeah.
And like you say, you know, it was amazing how quickly that happened. You know, vaginal exams are another real, you know, absolutely shocking thing that happened, and yet there's no outrage about it apart from from people like us. But you know, that already before the pandemic, we had a big problem with this vaginal exam situation. You know, where women are not told that they're optional. So they're told every 4 hours in labour, we're going to examine your cervix with our fingers and say how dilated it is and write it down on a chart. Well, I mean, we could talk more about that in itself, couldn't we? The way that women are just reduced down to sort of numbers on a chart, you know, dehumanized, you know, made into just one small body part that dilates or doesn't dilate, or fails or doesn't fail.
Yeah.
But, you know, the fact that women are not told that this is an optional thing. I mean, I've told so many women myself in person when I've been speaking at events and things that, you know, pregnant women, that, did you know that these are optional? They're so shocked and they're so relieved as well. And they're so incredulous that, like, you mean I can actually say no? And it's just so extraordinary that fingers are going into the bodies of women's vaginas, you know, into women's vaginas, and they don't know that they can say no. And then in the pandemic, it obviously got even worse, where they were told literally, you can't have your partner with you unless we know how dilated you are.
And that thing about vaginal examinations, cervical examinations, and women not realizing until you tell them that they're optional, is the other thing that it does for a lot of those women, is they are staggered at the idea that they are able to make a decision, and then they're concerned, because then they're like, well, how will I know? How will I know if my body's doing the right thing or not? Because they are so bought into this, like, internal misogyny that your body is failing, your body can't do what it's going to do, your body is destined to cause you or your baby harm, it's flawed, all of that kind of stuff. The idea that you could actually give birth, or that there might be other signs, you know, like this idea that actually you might be able to just look at a woman and think, yeah, she's probably quite far along, actually. Like, you know, you go to births, you don't need to stick your fingers in a woman's vagina to get a loose idea of roughly what's going on. And it does come back to this idea for me about, you know, who holds the knowledge controls the body. You know, it's a colleague of mine in Australia wrote the beginning part of this year about women and birth planning and making decisions in birth. And she was saying, you know, women have this idea that because they don't have academized medical knowledge, they therefore are not qualified to make decisions or to engage in, you know, care planning for themselves because they don't have the expertise. Well, you know, who determines what's expertise, who determines how we identify that information, and then if you are the person who holds the information, which is, you know, midwives, doctors, because they've got that, like, that professionalized knowledge, then you can control what happens next. And if we keep telling women, you don't know how your body works, and it's kind of true, because actually we don't tell women, and because, as we were saying earlier on, we don't have that culture where we can observe how bodies work. So it kind of is true that a lot of women don't really understand how their bodies work the first time they're having their baby. That's knowledge that's acquired throughout their childbirth career, and we tell them that their bodies are going to fail and that we need to intervene. It's like a catch-22, isn't it? Like, women, how it's really hard to step out of that. You have to work quite hard to do it.
Yeah. And it's literally summed up by the pictures you see on the, you know, the adverts for One Born Every Minute, where all of the professionals are standing round, they're holding the baby and smiling to the camera, and then you just see the woman's knees in the front of the frame, or her feet, you know. And that was what was so upsetting about that program, This Is Going to Hurt. And yet it was very, very difficult to argue that on, you know, on social media or a place like that. You get a huge amount of pushback if you say, this is really dehumanizing to women. And I always find that kind of shocks me, even now, sort of 10 years after, you know, of saying it. The fact that saying that women could have some expertise, or just saying that women could be treated better, just saying that women shouldn't be portrayed in that way as kind of like failing, leaking slabs of meat, really pisses people off. You know, you get a lot of people come after you if you say that kind of thing, and it always amazes me, because you think, really, do you really want to stay in this? You think that this situation is okay, where women are being portrayed like that on TV, but actually it's being reflected in real life, that, you know, go and sit down with your mum, your sister, your aunt, your female friends, ask them about their births. And if any of them tell you, oh my God, it was absolutely amazing. I felt so powerful. I felt so strong. It was the best day of my life. You know, I changed everything for me. It completely upgraded me as a human. I've never been afraid of anything since. I roared like a lion. You know, I'll give you 50 quid, because those women are like as rare as hen's teeth. It's just, it doesn't happen. It's so unusual to find a woman who talks about birth in that way.
And then what happens then is when women do talk about birth in that way, it becomes, two things happen simultaneously. The first thing that happens is things become very polarized. Like you say, you've either got people who are understood to be willful, naive, risky, thoughtless, flaky, you know, like, and oh, you I'm going to go and free birth in the trees, with the burning sage and the whale music. Or you've got that really heavily managed approach, and actually the reality is it's not that polarized. There's much more complexity in it, and also that's not what we're asking for. That's not what the objective of these conversations is. It's not to move anybody along that line. It's about sort of, I guess, flattening a hierarchy that exists like this. But the other thing that happens about it, as well as that polarization, is it kind of becomes collapsed in on itself, doesn't it? So then you're not able to have a conversation about these different issues, because actually the cultural issues are about, is it safe? Are women able to make decisions about themselves? Are women's bodies destined to fail? And actually what you can't then have a conversation about is humanization or relationality, or about male dominance in the birth room, or androcentric dominance in maternity care services, and about what women actually want and need, and about challenging some of these cultural stereotypes, because you just get caught up in that stuff of, you know, either biological essentialism or naturalistic fallacy, or, you know, whatever, and it just becomes, and also, as you say, social media doesn't help, because it becomes like a massive bun fight, doesn't it?
Yeah. But I mean, underpinning both of those polarities you just spoke about is the same thing, which is mistrust of women.
Yeah.
So the woman who wants to have, I mean, maybe not go off to the woods, because that doesn't really ever happen, but, you know, the woman who just says, I'm going to have a home birth, or I'm going to birth without midwives, or I'm going to ask my midwife to stay in the car and I'm just going to call her in if I need her, she is considered to be, you know, untrustable. In her decision making. She's considered to be like out of control. We need to bring her back into control.
Doesn't she understand? Don't you understand how dangerous this is? Let me lay it out for you in these terms so that you can see it on paper.
Yeah. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got women, you know, in hospital whose bodies are mistrusted. So underneath, you know, who are just doing what they're told, if you like, but who are going through traumatic situations simply because of that, you know, again, the mistrust in women that underpins everything.
And it's really interesting how that plays out again, practically, the pragmatics of it. You know, we go to all of the time and expense of building birth centres. You know, we've got 2 locally, and they are separate to the obstetric delivery suite in the main hospital within the trust, and they're lovely. They're really, really nice. You know, they're nice. They're nice places to be, but it's cost a lot of money to create them and to put them in place, because people are too nervy to have their babies at home, so we need this kind of middle ground. Well, then my question would be is, why doesn't the entire obstetric unit look like that? You know, like the part of the conversation that we're missing, you know, while we're having this conversation about, you know, women's bodies are mistrusted and misunderstood and all that kind of stuff, is actually, what do women's bodies need? Because we're not providing that. So even if we weren't talking about management, even if we weren't talking about induction of labour and coercive vaginal examinations and poor counselling around sonography and induction of labour and all those kinds of things, what we're just at a very basic level, we're not, as you said earlier, providing the estate which is appropriate in order to have a baby in. You know, we just, it's
I mean, I mean, with the whole of the sort of typical birth room that you might see on, you know, One Born or on the telly is built with the needs of the care provider in mind. So you've got doors that swing open so that they can come and go easily. Well, that's no good for a woman because she needs privacy. You've got bright lights so that the care provider can see. Again, no good. We need dim lighting. You've got a bed, which is perfect for the care provider because they can reach. No good for the woman because, you know, she is limiting the mobility of her pelvis and her ability for her body to open. You know, all of it is built with the needs of the care provider in mind. There's no understanding of female physiology at all in the modern birth room, and no also no one cares, or no one seems to care. But then, like you say, they are building these suites, so they must know something. The people who are paying for that, they do know that that's better. But then they're not retro building that into and ironically, the women who are in those labour wards are the higher risk women who would be the most likely to benefit from having a less technologized environment and a more humanized environment, because that would bring their risk down.
And again, what we're not, I think it's very hard to communicate this, I think, when you're working with women who maybe have 1 or 2 babies and who aren't as immersed in all of this stuff, because actually they've got other lives to live. They've got other kids, they've got to go to work, they've got other stuff that's happening. So for a lot of women, they're just entering maternity services just a couple of times in their lives, and these don't become like huge issues. But it's very hard to convey the idea that actually we're not talking about either or. We're not saying actually let's burn the whole thing down and let's not have any obstetric support whatsoever. What we're saying is actually we need to review this, because this is built in an androcentric model. This is built in a way that meets the needs of the standardized male body, and it meets the sort of theoretical practice approach, which is in a very androcentric medical model. Actually, birth is not pathological until it becomes pathological, in the same way that all parts of, all functioning physiological parts of the female body can face challenge at some point or other. But actually, until that point is reached, they're fine and functioning. And it's the same with birth. Women's bodies function absolutely fine, usually. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, then we need the support maybe of those services. But what we've kind of got the cart before the horse, and the reason that we've got I can remember having a conversation with my doula colleague a long time ago about why are maternity services so badly fucked up? Why are they so inappropriate for women? Is it that this is just the way the medical model works, or is there something that underpins it which is fundamentally misogynistic? And actually, the longer I work in it, I think there's a fundamental misogyny within maternity services, which is starting point that women's bodies are pathological. The starting point is women's bodies don't work.
But also it's also even more simple than that, isn't it? It's also, we don't care enough about women's health. Women can suck it up. Women, we're good at doing that. We don't make a fuss. We don't complain. We often can't complain because we've got a baby on one side and a toddler on the other. We've got, we're very, very good at saying, oh no, really, everyone was doing their best. Honestly, it's fine. I'm fine. I'll be fine in a couple of weeks. Just don't worry about me. We're very good at sort of not pushing back. And I think the system knows this. And it knows it can treat us like this.
And as you said, that's not just because we've internalized that way of being. It's because we live in a society where actually we don't have the structures required. Just to take us right back to the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about sort of that matrilineal line where women learn about female bodies from other women. That is, I think you said earlier on, you talked about it as the broken chain of wisdom in Give Birth Like a Feminist, right? We don't have the structures to support women, to allow women to either benchmark their experience as either great or freaking appalling, and we don't have the structures in place that allow women to then do something about it, because most women honestly are at home on their own with a new baby they don't know anything about. A lot of them are recovering from a physical and an emotional trauma and are unable to talk about it, and are surrounded by extended networks of women who have bought into what you were saying earlier is, at least your baby's okay, well, at least your baby's fine. Focus on having a new baby. Just, spend time with your baby. It will all be okay. You'll forget about it.
But the other thing is they have to invest, those women have to invest in that narrative, because it keeps them safe from some extremely difficult feelings and from their own trauma. If they admit it could have been different for me, then they have to go there and open up that wound. So what they have to think is it couldn't have been any different. And this is the story you hear often around birth, is that it's just potluck. You get what you get. It's like a deck of cards just thrown up in the air on the day. And women are told this, aren't they? There's no point making a birth plan. It's all potluck. Just go with the flow.
Out the window as soon as you walk through the door.
Exactly. So that whole narrative is also part of this, isn't it? Because it's saying what happens, you know, some women's bodies just go wrong and need all this intervention, and some women just get lucky and they just have this really straightforward birth. No one will be able to predict what your birth's going to be like, and you don't have any control over it. Yeah. But actually that's what the women who come through to the other side have to sustain that to be true, because the alternative is to go back to that memory and think, I was really let down. That trauma was unnecessary. That didn't have to be my story. I could have had a powerful experience, and instead I was dehumanized and degraded and traumatized. So those women have got to sustain that story. And then I don't mean that as a criticism of them. I support they're doing that because that's how they're keeping themselves safe from emotional pain.
And then the bigger picture from that is not only your own experience, but what that tells you about all of those people around you and about the culture that we live with. And that can be very confronting. The realization that actually women don't really matter. You know, use or exchange value. Your body doesn't really matter. Nobody really cares about you. You know, those are big thoughts to have to start to have. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to, you know, this idea of a client of mine a long time ago, many years ago, pre-pandemic, talked about granny fever and what happened when she was pregnant with her children and what happened to her mother and her mother-in-law. Because what happened to the mother and the mother-in-law was, as the pregnancy progressed, they would get increasingly intense and concerned about her, and, you know, really, you know, you need to do this, you need to do that. And it's about protection, but she was, you know, obviously because she was spending time with me and she was looking at, you know, disrupting her own birth story and stepping outside of it and having her babies at home. You know, they were really, really concerned for her, and it caused all sorts of kind of conflict for her and her husband and the extended family, because they were really concerned, and they were really concerned because they'd really had these experiences and they were genuinely worried for her. But the narrative is so powerful, it's so endemic, it's so strong, that it is impossible for lots of people to imagine the alternative. Like, what could the alternative look like? And as you say, if you've already had that experience, if your body has been harmed, if your emotions have been compromised, if you have had to recover, if your vulnerability has been compromised, you know, and you have had to recover from a trauma and bring a family, those are really hard things to think about. It could have been different. What if? Because these things become hardwired in the female experience. You know, I talk to women who I used to go see my grandmother in her old people's home, and they'd be like, oh, is she a midwife? And as soon as they know that you work with babies, you then get stories from women who had their babies 50, 70 years ago, and who remember their midwife's name and what the room was like and what the weather was like and what they had to eat afterwards. You know, this experience is transformative, and it is crystallized within women, regardless of whether it's good or bad. You know, it's fundamental, really.
Yeah. And in a similar way, breastfeeding, you know, you're talking about the sort of the mum and the mum-in-law, you know, and that sort of like anxiety. I think a lot of women whose mums or mother-in-laws used formula, who are then trying to break that cycle and breastfeed, will get a lot of those similar sorts of people coming around saying, do you really need to feed that baby again? And, you know, sort of almost like a negativity. And then there's a cultural negativity, obviously, as well about breastfeeding, isn't there? About, you know, don't do it in a swimming pool, and all of this kind of like anxiety around what is, you know, essentially completely, utterly natural and healthy fluid.
Yeah, and again, like the separation of the human from the physiological function, and the separation of mother from baby, and, you know, all of these things around mother's body's not functioning properly and not working properly, and
but it comes from that same place of pain, I think, because I think that's the other thing that happens to women, is that they're told a lot of the time, they're told it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that you didn't breastfeed, it's fine. It doesn't matter that you didn't have that natural birth that you wanted, forget about it. And they go, oh, no, you're right, you know, it doesn't really matter. But it does matter, because age 80, they're still talking to you about it in their retirement home. And they're saying, and, you know, like I've had women cry talking to me about their birth experiences, and they're in, you know, when they're in their 80s, or their breastfeeding experiences.
Yeah. And then you get the news report about, you know, children who are breastfed are more likely to pass their GCSEs and stuff. And then what you see is that tension between the individual and the cultural. You know, women are made individually responsible for these massive cultural narratives, these massive cultural stories, like, you know, women saying, you know, I couldn't breastfeed, I wasn't able to breastfeed my baby, or I chose not to breastfeed. And actually the reality is that those decisions and your ability to do it or not do it are hugely dependent on the stories you've heard about what breasts are, what their function is, how they're understood in society, whether you are working or not, do you have adequate maternity leave, is there any support around? For a colleague of mine has just set up a breastfeeding cafe associated to one of those birth centres that we were talking about. And it's being inundated by women who just want to sit with other breastfeeding women. And they don't feel like, I mean, some of them feel like they've got a problem and they're there because, you know, things aren't working the way that they'd expected them to. But it's often that it isn't a problem. It's just they don't have the context for what does breastfeeding look like. It doesn't look like one thing, you know, it looks like lots of different things because babies are different and boobs are different and mothers are different. And, you know, like the idea that women are solely individually responsible for making decisions about their pregnancies and their births and breastfeeding, when actually we are subject to these really big narratives, is also something which I think is very...
Yeah, but then the body gets blamed, doesn't it? Again, it's like, oh, I couldn't make enough milk.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I just had to have a cesarean. All of those stories are, you know, and yet that if you find out more about that story,
yeah,
you find it wasn't the woman's body at all that was to blame.
Yeah.
You know, it goes back and back and back. You know, in the case of the cesarean, maybe it was that enforced vaginal exam that started her off on a path that, you know, ended up on the operating table. And I'm not saying that's always the case. I'm aware that even having this conversation now, there might be people listening who this is, you know, triggering for, because it's always important to tread a path, isn't it? And to make clear that although we're trying to defend the female body's adequacy, we're not trying to say all women can have natural births, all women can breastfeed, it's easy, everybody should do it even if they don't want to. I'm not saying any of those things, and I never ever have. No. What I'm trying to say is there are a shed load of women who want those things, who aren't getting them unfairly, unjustly. And that's a massive disservice to women.
Yeah, and I think that's I think you're absolutely right, obviously, of course you are. But I also think it raises that, of course, I think it raises that thing also about how much women are told about their bodies, how much information they actually have about what has happened to them and why those decisions were made. I mean, again, I meet a lot of women postnatally who will start to tell you their birth story, and in the telling of that birth story, and it might be the first time they've verbalized it really, or, you know, they've had, or often what happens with women is I think they kind of develop a narrative that is easy to share with other people, that is not too challenging, but then you get to baby numbers, you get pregnant again, or something happens that means you actually need to investigate that and explore that in more detail. And what you realize is often women really do not know what has happened to them. They do not understand the chronology, they don't understand the language that was used, they don't understand the decisions that were made. You know, going back to that thing about women blaming themselves, they'll often say, well, I consented to that, I said yes. But the reality is they didn't really understand either the language that was used, or that they had options, or what the implications of that were. So this thing about you know, when women are making decisions, are they able to make free and informed decisions, is actually a really, really complex narrative. It is a really, really complex one that encompasses all sorts of different things. And I'm trying to think of any other scenario. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at elsewhere across the health services, the idea of making informed decisions is a really, really important one. And when it comes to maternity care, often it's not really that important, which, you know, we'd recommend this because da, 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 and then there's a bit of a checklist that you go through and then you do it and then that's it. There's no opportunity for adequate reflection to inform.
Yeah, but I think as well, when women are, you know, picturing like your woman we keep going back to, who we talked about at the beginning, who's thinking, what is birth going to be like, and who has no frame of reference for that. And medical professionals as well, who've kind of internalized that idea of it all being completely out of control. The idea of informed decision making within that doesn't really compute. So I think a lot of women think, you know, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to make any decisions. I'm not going to be able to think. It's all going to be like it is on the TV, like flashing blue lights and people running in and out with trolleys and buttons being pushed, and, you know, that kind of chaotic, fast-paced hospital drama kind of vibe.
Crisis, like a crisis.
Yeah. And that they won't actually have capacity. They won't be able to think or know what they want in that situation, but they're already primed with that before 10 years before they have a baby, 20 years before they have a baby. So the idea that in that situation they will actually be able to say, do you know what, no, I don't want that right now, is quite jars with that sort of impression, that narrative they've got, isn't it?
And who controls the knowledge? You know, if you haven't done a 7-year medical degree, are you capable of saying, actually, I don't want a vaginal examination, or actually, no, I don't want continuous fetal monitoring for the next 4 hours because it doesn't feel right for me and I feel safe. You know, it's all within that framework of what is risky and what isn't risky, you know, and in that context, the risk is, you know, if we don't do a vaginal examination, we won't know how dilated you are or the position that your baby's head in, and therefore that's a bit risky. Or if we don't do the continuous fetal monitoring, we won't be tracking your baby's heart rate, and therefore that presents a risk. What you're not doing is having the conversation the other side, which is, actually, if you do invade my body, you're compromising my faith in my own understanding and my own connection with my body, and you're potentially introducing infection. And actually, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't want different people's hands inside my vagina every 4 hours, and this is no different. And you're compromising like the hormonal relationship and all that kind of stuff. So risk assessments are very different. And
but this is where we need the relationship to come back as well, isn't it? Because a woman going into a situation with complete strangers who she's never met before, who has no relationship with them, you know, you're at risk of having this sort of power struggle.
Yeah.
Because she's read the books and she's had the doula and she wants to say no to this, that, and the other, and these guys over here think, you know, she's untrustworthy and doesn't know what she's doing, and, you know, they recommend this. She said, you know, and it shouldn't be like that. Yeah. It shouldn't be that only one has the expertise or the other has the expertise. We have to come to a place, and a grown-up place, where we say everybody's got some expertise in this situation. 80% of that expertise, especially as everything is proceeding normally, is with the woman. She has expertise in her body. She can hit. She's on the inside. Yeah. You know, she knows what's happening. But if things aren't going to plan, these other guys have the expertise. They know what to do, whether they're midwives or obstetricians.
Yeah.
You know, but you have to have that bridge of communication and trust between the two sides, and the medical side has to let go and step back. That's the problem. They're not allowing the woman to have that expertise, even when things are going normally.
Yeah, and I think
normally, you know what I mean, physiologically, proceeding as they should.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there's complexity in that as well. You know, when you look at the what's happening for healthcare professionals, midwifery crisis, you know, defensive practice because of litigation within those services. You know, there's a reason I'm a doula and not a midwife. You know, being a midwife at the moment is not a walk in the park. You know, no one is there for the glory and the riches. It's unbelievably hard and not made easier by any of these complexities, right? Yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? You know, there is a lot that goes into this, and I think, you know, just going back to what you were saying just there, you know, this thing about having a grown-up conversation requires us to be able also to say, women's bodies aren't trusted, women aren't trusted. There's a reason you're not listening to what women have said. I mean, I was at the International Birth Conference in Grange over Sands at the end of April, and, you know, really, really interesting, lots of really interesting papers, lots of interesting conversation. But the slightly depressing thing about it, you know, lots of energy, lots of passion, lots of enthusiasm, but there was very little in that was really groundbreakingly new, because it's the same stuff that women have been saying for decades. You know, nothing's changed. Women aren't asking for anything different. You know, we are asking for our bodies to be respected, for our boundaries to be respected, for our perspective to be respected. And this idea that this, you know, this fairly, or it's not new, but it's more intense and more overt idea of disembodiment, separating the woman from the body, separating the body from the experience, is really pernicious, I think, and it has the potential to do an enormous amount of harm, I think.
And I don't know if we're going to go there, but I mean, one of the only things that is new in conferences like that is this erasure of women from the language. And it still needs unpicking all of this, doesn't it? But there's got to be, it can't be coincidence that we've just about got to a point where women, like just 5-10 years ago, women were starting to talk about all of these physical experiences, these female biological experiences, share photos of them on Instagram, set up movements, groups, you know, help charities all around, and push harder for you know, women to be included in research, women's bodies to be taken more seriously, and questions that have remained unanswered for centuries to be answered. And all of that's happening, and for us to be able to say vulva and all of that, and no more censorship around women's words.
Yeah.
And then you go to a birth or breastfeeding conference today, not that I do, because I'm not allowed anymore, I'm not invited because I'm such a heretic.
You're bad.
But, really bad.
Well,
but the words are all being erased again, and we're having to watch our words again, and we're having to go through our articles that we've written and think, well, how can I say this without saying that word? Well, that word used to be vagina or vulva, but now that word is woman.
I mean, it's interesting. I think when I was at that conference, it would be fair to say that there was a good spectrum of speakers who were talking about women and who were using sex-based language, and then other speakers who were using gender-based language. Where I always end up with that is, you know, there's a statement that I think is very important to use, which is, you know, everybody can identify, in my opinion, everybody should be able to identify however they wish. However, when we're talking about maternity services, we are talking about biological bodies, and we have to talk about not just, you know, women over the age of 18. We're talking about women who are girls, actually, and women who don't identify as women, or who prefer not to identify as women, but therefore we use that word as a catch-all because that is the biological reality of what we're talking about. But I think when we're talking about improvements to maternity services and understanding why we are where we are in the maternity services, we're not just talking about biological terms, we're also talking about the implications of sex and gender roles, and what the gendered understanding of the biological sex is, and how that implicates within maternity services. You know, all the way through this conversation, we've been talking about women's bodies are understood to be flawed, women's bodies are understood to be failing, women's bodies are understood to be taboo, women aren't given the credence or the credibility to make good informed risk assessments. It's not an accident that we're talking about women. That is about male dominance, and it's about a society that is androcentric, based on the idealized, standardized image of the male. And we must be able to talk about that in order to resolve these things. And I think, you know, that obfuscation of sex and gender, where you know, where we're not clear about, are we talking about gender or are we talking about sex, actually does matter. And it's really important for everybody that we're able to say that, including, you know, people who don't understand themselves to be female and do have a preference to be described in masculine forms. They are not immune from any of this. You know, they're not immune from it just because, you know, they present in a more masculine way, or because they've undertaken some form of surgery or hormone replacement or whatever. It won't stop you from being harmed by the things that are causing other women harm in maternity care, because it's about your femaleness, it's about your female sex, it's not about your gender identity.
Yeah, I mean, none of this stuff is happening to people, it's happening to female people.
Yeah.
And if childbirth was something that male people did, I think it would take a very different shape.
Yeah.
It would probably go one way or the other. It probably would be quite polarized, actually. Wouldn't it? There'd be men who wanted to use all the technology going and literally have artificial wombs or whatever they could get their hands on, or cesareans straight from the get-go.
And there'll be others who see it as like climbing Everest or something.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Twins.
But whichever path they chose, they would get they would get the luxury support they needed to get to that, you know, end, I suspect.
Because it would be fundamental to the male experience, and men are important, and therefore it would be an important issue. I absolutely remember being pregnant with my first child, being like, I don't know, 39, 40 weeks pregnant, and really shitting my pants about what was to come, and sitting in the room on my own looking at this enormous belly thinking, oh my god, I can't believe that so many women do this. I can't believe that like 84% of women will have a baby, and are we all sitting around crapping our pants about it? Like, it's not a niche issue.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's just not a niche issue having babies. I always say, like, you know, 84% of women will have a baby by the time they're 45, but 100% of us are born. You know, like,
Yeah.
it's far from a niche issue. It's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And yet it's treated as if it doesn't really matter, as, oh, you know, we'll get to it when we get to it, or
Yeah.
you know,
And all that trauma as well. I mean, it's not even like it's just a little problem, you know, that, you know, we'll get to it because it's low down the list because it's only a small thing that's happening.
Yeah.
The levels of trauma that women are experiencing in birth, and
Yeah.
the way they're carrying that through into their life. And the other thing, if you flip it, that I think is always worth saying, is the levels of empowerment that women could be experiencing that they're missing because of what's happening to them. You know, how different would women be if they were, I don't want to use the word allowed, but, you know, given access, you know, in a way it is allowed because it's gate kept, isn't it? If they were given access to everything they needed to have the best possible birth. And even if they didn't have that kind of straightforward physiological, you know, candlelit water birth or whatever, if they felt however it panned out, if they felt really loved and cherished and appreciated from start to finish, and they felt like everything that happened, they were informed about and they consented to, when things started to go wrong, they were told what was happening and they were, you know, consulted, and they come to the other side feeling, you know, I had the best possible experience, that would make such a difference, you know, to humanity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I was talking to another couple yesterday who are pregnant with their first baby, and they've got this, like, you know, they are carrying the same idea that many of us carry about what a good birth looks like. And, you know, we know what that looks like, you know, spontaneous labor, vaginal delivery, no intervention, no drugs, you know, no perineal trauma, all the straightforwardness. And I was saying to them, actually, you know, yes, that is lovely, and that is great, and that does give you a great sense of empowerment. But I have also been to births that had, you know, an unexpected amount of intervention, where women came away feeling that they were very empowered. And the commonality, like the consistent thread between those two things, is exactly what you say. It's not how the baby comes out of the body, it's about how centered the woman was in that experience, how respected and valued she was. You know, that's what it's about. It's about everyone. Yeah, I mean, it's about centering the female experience. God, that's it.
Yeah. And what I'm, you know, the book that I'm working on at the moment, and what I'm interested in at the moment, is the thread that goes through it all.
Yeah.
You know, and that was why I wrote the period book for preteen girls, because, you know, I did this workshop. I always talk about Jane Hardwicke Collins whenever I'm talking about this, because she was such a big influence on me. She just turned on a light bulb for me. She's an Australian woman. She's on Instagram. She's so lovely. She's very spiritual. She runs this thing called the School of Shamanic Womancraft, and she's very into kind of like ritual and the seasons and everything. And she's very down to earth. She's not a completely like away with the fairies kind of person. She's just really, really lovely. And I did this workshop with her about menstruation, and she just invited me to go because she was actually over in this country, and she was doing it quite near where I live. And I went just thinking, yeah, this will be interesting. And it really turned on a light bulb for me, because what she got people to do in the workshop, women to do, I should say, because it was all women, was to join up the dots. So we had to reflect on our first periods, and how our mum gave birth to us, what we knew about our grandmothers and their periods and their births, and then our own birth experiences if we'd had babies. And when you start to sort of join the dots between it all, you know, what Jane says is that if a woman aged 25 or 30 who's pregnant for the first time comes to you, say you as a doula, Charlie, it's too late, because she's already internalized all of this negativity about her body since menarche, menarche, whatever you want to call it. I never know how you say that word. First period. It's another one of those words, isn't it? Like, you know, so if we can get to women when they're young girls and change the narrative at that point, then we're setting them up for a completely different path, a completely different relationship with their body, because our relationship with our female bodies starts in puberty and when we have our first period.
And that is sort of the arc that we were talking about earlier on, isn't it? You know, with the pinnacle here of, you know, motherhood as a radical act, or motherhood as an act which radicalizes women. You know, we go through our lives absorbing, imbibing all of this mythology, this unhelpful stories about, you know, our female bodies and the physiology of our bodies and the value to ourselves and society of our physiological bodies. And then you have a baby, and whether it has been, for a lot of the women that I work with, whether it was very traumatic or very positive, it is that point that makes them start to go, oh, hang on. And then you're peeling the onion, like you said, you know, you're kind of taking the layers away and going backwards and going, oh, actually, these things are connected. I can see how these things work. And then you're sort of, you know, I was watching Jane talk to Victoria Smith last night about hags, you know, which takes us back to the chain of wisdom and that matrilineal line. You know, nobody likes, not nobody, you know, there is a reason that that older women are seen as hags, because we wiped your shitty ass. You know, we know what your bodies are. We know how you came into the world. You know, we get it. We can see the pragmatics and the relationality and the truth of it all. And that's not a story that many people want to hear, because it's uncomfortable and it raises questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really even talked about menopause, which is another sort of hot topic at the moment, that is getting that kind of double-edged treatment you were talking about, where on the one hand it's the lid's coming off it and women are being told, oh, it's okay to talk about menopause now and you can have menopause leave in your workplace and da. But on the other hand, it's, you know, being commercialized, monetized, like
medicalized.
But you know, it's another experience where, and it's medicalized, and I found that's quite an interesting one. That's quite controversial, because a lot of it's exactly like talking about something like epidural. It's like a lot of women are really invested in HRT, and I'm not judging those women either, because I'm 48 and I haven't got to the point. I'm doing it a bit like I did childbirth. It's like, if it gets really shit, I'll have the epidural, you know? But I think it's also, the other parallel is that it's a bit like, you know, with childbirth, we say to women, well, you've got these two choices. You can have all the drugs, or you can just try and have a natural birth, you know, try. But then we take that woman who's trying to have a natural birth and we put her in an environment where there's absolutely shit all else to help her. She hasn't got the relationship-based care. She hasn't got the nice birth environment. She hasn't got the feeling of being safe. She hasn't got the really good antenatal education. She's just like been told, oh, it's better not to have an epidural, so I'm going to try and have a natural birth. There's absolutely nothing about that birth that's natural. Nothing is natural apart from her pressure on herself to have a natural birth, which won't be natural at all.
Or to not have the intervention. It's about the holding of the
It's about what you're not going to have rather than what you're going to call in and bring in. So we know that childbirth worked better, even though, like 200 or 300 years ago, women would have died because they didn't have the medical help. The ones that didn't die had everything right, because they had all of those women around them that they knew, and they understood how to massage and sing songs and make cakes and make a lovely atmosphere, and, you know, make the woman feel loved and use herbs and all of those things. That bit was good. Obviously, the bit where they couldn't get to a hospital wasn't so good if they needed to.
But also, let's clarify what that was. In a lot of instances, it was about not being able to stitch significant blood loss, and it was about infection. So I think, you know, often when we talk about that, it's important to like contextualize what those significant were as well.
Exactly. Well, that's another whole, But I mean, you know, so going back to the menopause thing and that analogy, I think it's very similar. Is that some women are thinking they're sort of seeing the books at the moment, which are very, you know, a lot of the narrative at the moment is really, really pro HRT. And they're thinking, do I want to do that, or should I do it naturally? But naturally, they've got nothing else in the file. That wisdom's not there again. So they've either got to just suffer, like you do if you don't have an epidural, when there's nothing else there for you. So it's the choice is suffering or drugs, basically. And there's so much. I mean, I've been writing this chapter about menopause in the past sort of 2 or 3 weeks, and I've learned so much about menopause I didn't know. And it's just like, oh my God, you know, there's so many interesting things that are just not in these books. They're just not there. And then another thing that happens, which is another sort of feminist issue, I think, is that those wisdoms are considered to be a bit silly,
not real knowledge.
No, it's not real. It's like, oh, what herb, you know, what sort of yoga, or don't be silly, you know, seeds. What do you mean seeds? You're a silly girl. Have the HRT, you know. So the same sort of things. It's undermined as silly girls knowledge or old wives stuff.
Yeah. And again, it's that tension between the individual and the social or the systemic, isn't it? You know, like it's exactly what you're describing. You know, you can make an individual decision to not have the epidural or to not have the HRT, but in the absence of the social structures that are required to make that easier, i.e., you know, midwives who have got really good training in tacit relational care and who, but you know, have a commitment to the not an unreasonable but a reasonable commitment to supporting the physiological process, you know, or you don't have structures that support women who are experiencing menopause, then actually your individual decision is really compromised. You know, it's a real uphill struggle, isn't it? Because you don't have the structures around you to support the decision that you make. It's like breastfeeding. You know, you can say I would like to breastfeed, but the vast majority of women in this country don't breastfeed until 6 months because we don't have the social structures in place to facilitate it and make it easy for them. So even if you are committed to the idea of breastfeeding your child because you've done the reading and you understand the research and because it's important to you, actually if the structures aren't there to support it because we don't live in a society that values it, then it's really hard for you to attain that. And that's not about your failing or because you have a silly idea. It's because we don't live in a world that values motherhood.
Yeah. And it's all about how your culture makes you feel about yourself and what it tells you about what it means to be a woman. And when it comes to menopause, it's interesting again, because there have been quite a few studies that have shown that women who live in cultures where older women over 55, are literally upgraded in the social group, they maybe become leaders or they get special privileges or they're treated with reverence and respect, don't have anything like the menopausal symptoms that we have in the West. So how you're made to feel about that experience, that rite of passage, that change from fertile woman to older woman, postmenopausal woman, and what you're told that postmenopausal woman is, can make a difference to your actual physical symptoms. Similar to when you're in the birth room and you're told, you know, you have to leave your dignity at the door, or women's bodies don't work very well. You know, that actually affects you at a physical level.
Yeah, you may as well have the epidural now because the anaesthetist going off to a trauma somewhere else. So changes your perception of what's going on within your own body.
Yeah, I mean, Adam Kay knows that. He literally wrote a book called "This Is Going to Hurt," and the joke of that is that, you know, if someone says to you, "This is going to hurt," it hurts more. And that, but that's about the only insight he had about what's going wrong with childbirth. He left it at that.
Because he's inculcated in it, isn't he? You know, like it's a it's a really interesting thing. The idea of this is a social media thing as well, isn't it? This idea of whether people are bad people or good people, you know, how do they fit within the narratives? And again, I think it's that idea of individualizing what are actually much bigger issues, making individual people responsible for. I do accept when I read that book, I was like, oh God, oh my God, can you hear yourself? You know, it's all about the filter, isn't it? It's all about, you know, how do you see that? How do you read it?
Well, perhaps you needed a sensitivity reader.
I know that you benefited from one, Millie, so maybe you could recommend one.
Well, I did have one actually in the end for the period book, but not the ones who were originally suggested, who were, anyway, I won't talk about that one here. But yes, interesting experience. But yes, in some ways, you know, this idea of sensitivity readers, I think it's an interesting question. If we're going to have them, then if a man is writing about women's experiences like childbirth, then, you know, should he not be treated with that same...
I mean, that's the interesting thing about that book, though, because even though he's not actually writing about women's experiences, he's writing about quite male experience, quite masculinized experiences in an environment which is overwhelmingly female. So, you know, that like and that, I mean, that is an encapsulation of the issue, isn't it? It goes back to my thing about who holds the knowledge controls the body, and that's not necessarily overt. It's that, you know, that real subtleness, which is about, you know, women read Adam Kay's book and they're like, oh right, well he would know, wouldn't he, because, you know, he's done the training, he's written the book, he's had a TV series made, he really knows what's going on. I have a very, 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 very lovely friend who I've known since I was about 18, who's a consultant obstetric anaesthetist, and he and I have some, as you would imagine, some quite interesting conversations. And where we've ended up is, you know, there are a number of perspectives on all of this stuff. You know, he doesn't see physiological birth because he's a consultant obstetric anaesthetist, so he's only ever called in when there's a problem, and he doesn't see what leads up to, you know, what are the situations that have led up to him being called into the room. Whereas, you know, the women that I work with are actively seeking to have a better experience than they believe is currently available within the NHS, and that's why I'm working with them. So, you know, inevitably he and I are seeing slightly different perspectives, and that, you know, the reality is not all women are the same, not all women want the same thing, not all women will approach birth or pregnancy or motherhood in the same way. And that, I don't think that's what either you or I are arguing for, this sort of biological essentialism where, you know, women get pregnant when they're young, breastfeed their babies, stuck to the kitchen sink. It's about recognizing the value of the female body and understanding when you make decisions why you are making those decisions, and whether those are based in the reality of your body or this kind of masculine mythology about bodies and birth.
It's interesting what you say though about that missing knowledge of what a straightforward physiological birth looks like, because I think that's a really big problem for obstetricians. It's a really big problem for midwives. It's a really big problem for women. You know, that it's very, very difficult. There aren't many births now that are completely natural from start to finish, that don't have any intervention whatsoever. It's incredibly, you can find films of them. But, you know, interestingly, one time, quite a few years ago now on Twitter, I watched this. It was quite near Christmas. I think it was snowing or something. It was one of those days where it was a snow day or something. I've got this vague memory. And I watched this amazingly beautiful birth video, home birth video. And at the time, I'd been having a variety of conversations with quite a few different obstetricians on Twitter about birth and positive birth. You know, this was when I was right at the peak of sort of writing about birth and running the positive birth movement. And I added them in a tweet. I said, you guys, you know, it's snowing outside. You know, we're all stuck in. Watch this video, it will change your life. It's so beautiful. And my God, it was very, very triggering for them. It was interesting, and I still remember it. And one of them even wrote a blog about how he'd finally forced himself to watch this, only after huge pressure, because they were like, don't be ridiculous kind of thing. Why would we want to watch that? They were really pushed back against it. They were really, really offended and, you know, triggered. I hate that word, but you know what I mean? They really were. And yeah, then eventually one of them did watch it and wrote about how dangerous water birth is and how hard it is for him to watch it, because he just, you know, and it was just absolutely, you know, proved the point.
Yeah.
Just completely proved the point in one sort of little Twitter situation, you know. And I'm not saying, you know, have to do this, not all men, not all obstetricians thing, don't you? I'm sure there's lots of obstetricians out there who would happily watch a water birth. But at the end of the day, we've all got to admit that those sorts of stories are missing from our culture, and that is to women's detriment.
Absolutely. Which feels like rather a nice place to finish off. I think we've covered a lot of territory, I think, today, and it's been really lovely to talk to you again. It feels like a really long time. Next time, can we do it with a glass of wine or something?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, definitely.